Hey viewers, my name's Cara. I am doing my nails and I wanted to do a vlog, so I'm doing it. I literally just finished watching a video from Thorn Mooney that was uploaded a couple of days ago from the time I'm actually getting to watch it, and you're also going to be seeing this video probably like a week after I am recording it, so because I just publicly uploaded the last video that you will have seen on my channel, which was a brief update from when I was at the Buckland Museum and working on something, and I just smudged my nail polish moving around. Anyway, black and sort of a teal bluish green color alternating. I've already done my hands. Now I'm doing my feet to match, but opposite. Anyway, so you won't be seeing this video right away when I upload it. This will be after the fact, but from the time I am recording this, I just finished watching it and it was uploaded, I think, 2 days ago. Thorn is sort of responding to something that was brought up in a blog post by Christopher Penczak, who is an author and teacher, if you don't know that name already. Thorn Mooney as well, similarly. And I did not read Christopher Penczak's blog post, but the content of the topic as it came through Thorn in her vlog really just made me want to talk about it too. And since part of the conversation was about the way that we used to make videos and that YouTube was for vlogging, and we started with vlog channels, vlog, VLOG being video log. A blog is a weblog, where it is usually typed or written in some way. Vlog is a video style log. It's like a diary, like a journal entry. So since that was part of the conversation, I thought it would be appropriate to just set up the camera right where I was already sitting. I'm just on the couch doing my nails. So a lot of things on YouTube have changed in the last 10 years, which is something Thorn brings up. One of them is kind of like what people think a vlog is, but I won't actually go into that in this video because that'd be a lot. Anyway, the actual major topic is about generations of craft practice, like witchcraft practice. And so this is based on the blog post that Christopher Penczak made. But it just immediately reminded me of so many conversations that I have at the Buckland Museum as a tour guide, talking to our guests and answering questions. This has come up multiple times, and for me, it was sort of spurred by the fact that I have been rereading part of it that I had already read, and then reading the rest of the book by Ethan Doyle White entitled Wicca, subtitle History, Belief, and Community in Modern Pagan Witchcraft. There is a chapter in that book called The Charmed Generation, which is sort of about this 90s teen witch generation that came up when the TV show Charmed was first on the air. And that is a category that both Thorn and I fall into. And so sometimes this idea comes up in conversations at the museum with guests. And I talk about how, some people actually refer to that as the Charmed Generation or the 90s teen witch movement or generation or whatever, what have you. That's my witch generation as well. So this idea that Thorn's talking about, that Christopher must have been talking about in the blog, that it's not about a person's chronological or biological age, like how old I am in human years. That's not what we mean when we're talking about generations of witchcraft necessarily. What we're really talking about is when somebody got involved in the craft, or when they were exposed to it, really, I guess, too, because you could be exposed to it quite a bit earlier and not actually get involved yourself until later. So just keeping that in mind, sometimes people might have that sort of added level of nuance. Also, something else I was thinking of, so you'll want to go watch Thorn's video as well. I might not give the entire background of stuff that I'm responding to, but something else that I was thinking was also that some people, Thorn specifies that it's not just when, but also how. And that stuck out to me because some people might be getting into witchcraft right now, but they're not getting into it the same way that people of different chronological ages are getting into it right now, right? So like right now, we might think of like the internet and social media as having a lot to do with how people are getting into witchcraft, how they're getting their information. We talk about TikTok, for example, being able to find information and other people through hashtags on Instagram, stuff like that. But you might have, chronologically older people who are getting into the craft right now, but they're not using those social media platforms. So maybe they're getting into it now in 2020, 2021 type area, but they are still getting into it using books. So we might have that in common because I was a book-taught witch. That's a term that I have begun to use a little bit more frequently. Again, it's sort of useful in conversations that I have with guests at the museum now and again. So we might have people who are getting into it now as book-taught witches as well. So it's not just the when, it is still the when, because all of the other events that have sort of happened throughout each decade, I think still influence the overall climate that people are coming into it in, if I can use that term in this way and not sound completely ridiculous, the climate of witchcraft. But I think you know what I mean by that. But it is also how and like the exact avenues that they are using. So as I mentioned, YouTube was sort of part of the conversation, and Thorn talks about getting started in learning about witchcraft and Wicca specifically for her at the time, and that was for me as well. Those were the first sort of resources that we were able to get our hands on, were Wiccan-based witchcraft sources. Talking about what that was like and like what kind of technology and resources we had at our disposal at that point. I don't actually know Thorn's exact age, but I think Thorn is a little bit chronologically older than me, but not a ton. Not a significant enough amount to feel like we have completely different generational witchcraft experiences, right? So we're close enough that a lot of this is the same. But like, for example, I don't remember when my family got to the internet. I remember that I was kind of young, but it wasn't around since I was born, right? Like it did come later. But I remember like playing a lot, like I had dial-up for one thing. I remember playing a lot of like PC games with my mom when I was younger, but I don't remember having access to the internet until quite a bit later, but I don't know the exact year. And I don't think my mom would at this point either. I could try to ask her, but I do remember getting into YouTube, of course, in the late 2000s. I didn't even have an account before. Like I knew YouTube was a thing. People shared YouTube videos. It was mostly music videos at the time. I wasn't really aware that just anybody could like upload a video to YouTube until, people started sharing videos of people posting dumb things on YouTube, right? Like doing ridiculous things with their friends kind of thing. And that wasn't something I was personally into. So again, like I just didn't really have a concept of what YouTube could be at that time. So, like, I had seen some videos and stuff, but I didn't even really have an account, I don't think, until quite a bit later, toward the end of high school. And then I started uploading videos to my channel in 2008, which was the year I graduated high school. But I think it was the summer after I graduated that I started uploading video files that I already had on my computer from other stuff that I had done previously. So the first video that I uploaded was in 2008, but it was something that had taken place maybe a year or two prior. It was actually a summer solstice drum circle that my mom and I had attended that was hosted by some of her friends, spiritualist friends, people who were really into meditation, kind of new age-ish, but yeah, not people who identified as pagans and witches, but like spiritual, magical people is kind of how I thought of them. And those people in particular were a big part of how I got exposed to witchcraft and how I started my path, but that's kind of a separate topic. But so I started like uploading videos on YouTube in 2008, 2009, but when Thorn was talking about this, like, you know, we didn't have YouTube even to learn from when we got into witchcraft and started learning about it, reminded me that, like, yeah, in the 90s, these things literally just didn't exist. Like, these things that we think of as so intrinsic to how we witch, how we find witchcraft community or pagan community, like YouTube for me, such a huge thing. YouTube did not exist before 2005. I wasn't on it and using it until 2008 or 2009, but it didn't even exist prior to 2005. And Thorn was talking about a lot of Llewellyn books, for example, Llewellyn publications, them having a big boom of a bunch of titles coming out in the late 90s, like the tail end of the 1990s. I tend to associate the year 2001 with a big boom of Llewellyn books in particular, because there are so many books that, like, now that I am such a big proponent of, like, looking at books in context and looking at when they were published, for all of these same reasons, right? Looking at the time that something was published, as far as what else was going on at that time, where was that author in their life and in their practice at that time, because books are time capsules of what that author was thinking when they published the thing, or when they wrote it, really, right? Because sometimes they write it years before it's ever even published. So by the time a book is published, an author could have learned new things or changed some of their ideas about some of the stuff that was previously written, right? Again, separate topic, but worth a brief mention. But yeah, so I associate 2001 with having a lot of great books, because now that I'm paying attention to the year that things were published, when I go back through a lot of my books that I own, or when I see a book in the secondhand bookstore or whatever, and I'm like, oh, this is a great book, maybe I'd like to own this, and I flip up through it, and I go to that, you know, info page, publication info page, and I see when it was published, I feel like there is this pattern that, like, everything that I think of as being, like, key to what was going on when I got into witchcraft were a bunch of books that were published in 2001 specifically. And I've mentioned this multiple times, like, out loud, when I notice, I pull another book off the shelf, I open it up, it's 2001, I'm like, damn, 2001 was a good year for the witchcraft books, right? So, yeah, the early 2000s, late 90s sort of witchcraft stuff is the stuff that I was mainly exposed to. Thorn talks about Cunningham and Ravenwolf quite a bit. I've literally written a poem about the start of my practice that mentions Cunningham and Ravenwolf by name, because that was it, right? Like, those were the things. And now there are so many different things that people can learn from. And so it's like having completely different sort of generational experiences and exposure and ideas based on what are the things that we're being exposed to. And I think we all have opinions about the stuff that's coming out now, some that are great and some that are not so great, right? There are some things that we're like, yeah, this is awesome. I love that this is coming out now. I love that people can be learning from this now, because maybe it's helping us get a couple steps ahead of where we were previously. Like, these resources are really great. They're answering questions that were not answered then. They are responding to problems that were not responded to then, right? But then I feel like equally almost, there are resources coming out now that we're like, why is this coming out now? I could have maybe understood it if this came out decades ago, but not now. Like, now we should be here, right? Like, we kind of expect that as a community that we have all progressed, and we somewhat forget, and I've seen other people talk about this too. This is not from this specific video from Thorn, but this is something else that a lot of people have been talking about too, that a lot of us tend to forget that things that for us have come up time after time after time after time every year for the past couple decades, that feel like we should all collectively be here. Some people are just coming into the witchcraft movement, the neo-pagan movement now, right? So this is the first time they're seeing a lot of these things being discussed. This is the first time they're hearing about some of these issues. So while we all might have started here and progressed to here, and we think everybody should be here, some people are coming in here. Some people are coming in here. Some people are coming in here, right? You know, and some people are meeting us right there. Like, some people are coming in like on board with exactly where the discourse has kind of led up to, but some people aren't. And that doesn't mean that they're worse or that they're not good or whatever, right? It's just like, we have to remember a little bit what we were exposed to at the time. And again, I feel like it's a little bit different because times in general do change and evolve too. So like, again, I don't want to use the term climate. I feel like that's weird. Maybe it's not weird, maybe it's just me. But, you know, like the social climate, the technological climate, the witchcraft discussion, the sort of collective place that the wider community is, if there can be any sort of collective place that any wider community is. Like, these are all kind of illusions of categories, right? But this place, I feel like, does influence people who are coming into it now. Like I said, if they're tapped into that in some way, that does influence people now, the way that Thorn talks about in the video, the satanic panic being part of the wider social situation heavily impacted the way that witchcraft and then Wicca specifically were being talked about in the late 90s and into the early 2000s. Like, that wider social issue did affect that, and so the way that we handle social issues today does affect how people are getting into it now. So again, like, it's kind of hard for me to say because I still do, like, even though I'm saying there are things we have to remember about where people are coming into this movement, and that for a lot of people this is the first time they're hearing these things, I do still also have some expectations that, like, okay, but now it's 2021 and a lot of us have been having these conversations for a long time, so why are people still coming into it now having never heard these things? Or like, how can they come into it now and be in it for a couple of years and be involved in talking to other people, and yet they're still not hearing these major conversations coming up? How is that still happening? Because I feel like that's not necessarily on those beginners. That's not on those new people who are coming in. It's, and maybe it is, because some of it is maybe they're only looking at the old resources that have been available for a long time, which in many cases are still good for like basic foundational practice, but are not talking about those issues, the like social issues, justice-based issues, you know, whatever, representation, appropriation, you know, all of these types of things. Maybe they're looking at things that we're not discussing those things openly, so maybe there is an element of that. But I also feel like if they are in conversation with us, for example, any of us in the wider community, it's kind of on us to make sure that those conversations are reaching people who are new to the conversation, right? That we are welcoming them in, that we are letting them know, you know, what is good about those older resources and maybe what's not. And usually for me, what's not is the element of it needing to be updated to the context of where we are now. Like, I still like a lot of the old books and other resources that I started out with back in the day, late 90s, early 2000s. And as I tell people all the time, like, a lot of the kind of bones of this stuff, like the foundational material about basic practices, a lot of that is still good, still relevant, still being practiced the same way to this day. Like, there hasn't been a lot of reinvention of the wheel as far as like really basic practices, but there has been reinvention of the way we talk about certain things or the way we conceptualize certain things, like the role of gender in how we discuss divinity and ourselves, and how we approach community in more accessible ways and more representative ways. You know, these types of things, like, that tends to be what I talk to people about and try to update them on, you know. And I feel like that's my responsibility, right? Like, it's one thing to hand somebody an old book and say, there's good info in here, this is how I learned. And it's another to say, bear in mind this was written, for example, 30 years ago or something, and a couple major points in here have, you know, there's a lot more going on now than there was when this was written. So you're going to need supplemental material about some of that stuff, because we've learned more over the years, right? Anyway, Thorn really wanted to hear about just like what was going on at the time that we got into witchcraft and what that was like for us. So to get back to that a little bit, obviously those were the books. And I've done videos, by the way. I have videos on this channel / Pagan Perspective. I forget. I think I did it on this channel of like the witchy books that I sort of feel like were key to my practice over the years. So I'll link that in the end screen of this video, and maybe I'll put it in the description too, but definitely in the end screen. I'm much better about using the end screen, so when you get to the end of my videos, there's usually relevant stuff in the end screen there. I specifically select them. It's usually not like a choose whatever is most relevant for the viewer. Sometimes I put those in the end screen, like a dynamic end screen that, you know, it's based on what you actually search and what it thinks would be best for you from my channel, but usually I select specific things that are relevant to whatever I was talking about. So I'll put that one on there. So I've talked more about like show and tell of these specific books, but websites, Witchfox was a thing, and I think, without looking it up, I think that Thorn was right saying that that came out in 1999, and Witchfox was such a big thing too, and that didn't even exist until the end of the 90s, right? Like, so prior to the 90s, really, like, so much was so entirely different. But I believe that 1999 is correct because Witchfox shut down at the end of 2019, and I remember a lot of people citing 20 years as how long it had been around. So that is why I think Thorn was correct without actually fact checking it. So correct us both if we're wrong. But yeah, I remember Witchfox being a big thing, and for years, and still up to the beginning of 2020, people were recommending Witchfox because people did not know that it had shut down at the end of 2019, because it's just a thing that everybody knows about. Although what had happened was a lot of people were not actively using it anymore, which is part of why they decided to shut it down, because people were moving to things like Facebook groups and all these other types of things for finding people, and they felt that it wasn't being utilized, and it was no longer worth the money and the time and the effort that was needed to keep up that website and all of those listings and so on. But Witchfox was definitely a thing that, starting out, it was the thing everybody said to use. And since I was quite young when I started, I wasn't even 18 yet, I wasn't even 16 yet, in the really, early time, I did not feel comfortable using websites like that. Like, I did not put out like a personal page on there being like, hey, I'm a young witch in the area, right? Because I had already learned through my research that most things like covens, for example, don't work with folks who are younger than 18 for legal reasons. And again, that I think comes out of that satanic panic type of thing, right? That Thorn was talking about. People went to jail over stuff like this. And for years, people were still afraid of having their children taken away if other people found out that they were pagans or witches, and all of the negative thoughts and feelings that come from what people think we're doing without actually knowing what we're doing, right? So people having the authorities called on them and all these types of things. So because of that, a lot of groups made it kind of a blanket rule that, like, we're not going to teach or have anyone at our events that is younger than 18, because we want you to be a legal adult in the country in which we are operating, and we don't want there to be any legal issues with people's parents when they find out what they're doing, and that we're allowing a 16-year-old or younger to come to these rituals or whatever, right? So I had already learned about that, so I was not using Witchfox in the early years of my witchcraft. I was looking at it to see if there were any covens, for example, advertising in my area, which there usually were not. And as I grew up and started attending events as a young adult and meeting more people, I learned that that did not mean there were not covens in the area. It meant that they were not advertising publicly, and that is still the case to this day. And people ask me about that all the time too. And that's something I had to learn as I got older and got exposed to other people, just meeting other people, making friends that would then be willing to tell me, like, yeah, there is a coven, there is this, that, and the other coven, and they are this tradition, and they are just not looking for new students at this time. They don't advertise publicly. If you're ever interested, I know the way you could get in touch with people, kind of thing. But that's not something that was just readily made available to me as a complete beginner using the internet, right? But yeah, Witchbox is no longer a thing because all of the other technology sort of surpassed it in people's minds, even though, like I said, people still knew Witchbox existed, and I heard people recommend Witchbox to other people in person after it had closed down because they hadn't heard the news, because they weren't actually keeping up with the website itself, but they knew that it was the place to go. So that's a really big thing that is entirely different now. PantheaCon now is no longer a thing. I never got to go to PantheaCon, but that was another thing that I was very aware of, like festivals and conventions and stuff. There are still many others. I still hope to go to others in the future. But yeah, there were a couple websites, I'm not even going to remember the names of them now, but they are defunct, that were really big for me when I first started out. I found these few websites that, you know, were not just covered in like glittery designs, because that felt weird to me at the time. Even then, I was like, this doesn't feel like an official website. This feels like somebody my age threw a thing together. And maybe that wasn't the case. Maybe some people just like glitter and that's cool. But I had found a few websites that to me felt reputable and that had good information about a lot of different things, and I referenced them constantly. And, you know, those websites don't even exist anymore. So that's a big thing for me. Very early blogging, so back to blogs, very early blogs. And I made a friend through that blog site who also had a blog about their practice in their specific tradition. And they were in a tradition, and it was a family tradition, and they were initiated into it and all of this, right? And then here's me, like book taught, solitary, non-initiate, not even thinking that that's anywhere on the radar for me at that point. And I made friends with this person, and they were able to share a bit about what it was like for them from their perspective, and vice versa, because, you know, they grew up with it being part of their family tradition, so they didn't really understand fully what it was like for me to have been raised in a completely different setting and then learn about these things through books. But then, you know, we were reading some of the same books, so we had that in common. And years later, I actually finally met that person in person at a local event, because I happened to attend local events, and they came up to me after a workshop. They attended a workshop that I had presented, right? So I also went from attending events to then presenting workshops at my local events and wanting to be a little more present and offer back to the community in that way. And this person came to one of my workshops and came up to me after and like gave me their handle from the blog site, and I burst into tears because I was like, wow, like this is a person I hadn't talked to in years, and I had made friends with them via this blog site, and they were like one of the first people who exposed me to the idea of what traditional witchcraft, like witchcraft in a specific tradition, in a lineaged tradition, initiatory tradition, what that looked like. And that was at a time that a lot of other people on the internet who either were part of those types of traditions or at least claimed to be because they thought it seemed cooler or gave them more authority or whatever, a lot of those people used it, whether they really had the authority or not, they did use it to say that they had authority over other people. And so it was kind of like they would tell you they were part of one of those traditions, but they wouldn't tell you what it was like, because they were very adamant that that is how they thought it should be done and no other way was valid and blah, 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 right? The horror stories that we hear about some folks. Not everyone is like that, trust me. It really is kind of a loud vocal minority sort of among all of the other experiences that I've had. But yeah, everyone else at the time that I had been exposed to who claimed to be from that sort of background was kind of mean about it. And this person was the first person who was really like willing to have honest conversations with me about what it was like and the differences and whatever. And then, you know, so we met in person, and then a couple years later we actually co-facilitated a workshop from those two different perspectives for one of our local events, talking about like differences and similarities between those two approaches to witchcraft and sort of the pros and cons of each, and like what kind of person might be more drawn to this type of practice versus that type of practice. And yeah, that all came from having a really ridiculous blog on, like, I had like 7 or 8 blogs back in the day. I was a big blogger. So obviously when YouTube came out, I became a vlogger. Because it's in some ways so much easier to just sit here and ramble at the camera and not have to type it out, you know? But I do love writing. I haven't done a lot of blogging in a long time. I haven't sat down and written much. I mean, I'm on my phone constantly. I'm typing novels to people all of the time, but I haven't like sat down and wrote a blog post in a long time. And I do want to get back to that, which is one of the other things I've been thinking about incorporating back into how I spend my time, which I talked a bit about in the previous video on this channel, possibly updating my schedule, you know, the frequency with which I upload videos, maybe doing different things at different times. Maybe it's vlogs, maybe it's Patreon videos, whatever. But yeah, there were a few websites. The religionstolerance.org site about what the Bible really says about witchcraft was hugely influential to me, and I referenced it all of the time because they talked about how it's all about the translation, right? That like what was actually being talked about was magic that was specifically done to cause harm, like malicious magical practices, which in various translations, people translated that to witchcraft, because that is what people thought witchcraft was that it was only ever negative, malicious, magical practice. But to me, I was like, but that's not always what we're doing, right? And for many people, that's never what we're doing, right? Like, we're not doing magic that is intended to make your crops fail and curdle the milk right in your cow's udders, right? So I was like, oh, they're not even talking about the same type of magic that some of us are doing. Okay, you know, so like that website was something that I referenced a lot and that I brought up in conversation with people a lot. That like, yeah, guess what? Magic isn't just used for one specific type of thing that the church was worried about. What else? I'm trying to think of some other, but yeah, there was like various books and a handful of websites that over time, comparing what I was learning from books and what I was learning from websites, I started to learn kind of what was more common knowledge among a lot of folks who were talking about stuff. And I can't remember the name of the original website because the website has like changed hands and changed names multiple times. And I think the specific blog writer that I'm about to mention has, it's either been the same website that they've written for years and the website has changed, or they've written for multiple similar websites too, maybe both. I think the original at the time was Learn Religions, but I really, really liked the blog posts, the articles there that were written by Patty Wigington. And so over the years, even though websites changed, it was like Learn Religions, and then it was part of ThoughtCo and whatever. I continued following Patty Wigington's articles because they were some of my favorite that I was always referencing. They had good material. Years later, I then met Patty Wigington at a local pagan pride event. I had no idea that entire time that she lived in the same state as me, that she was also in Ohio. And we were both at Dayton, Ohio Pagan Pride presenting workshops in the same year. You know, so this is someone that I had grown up in witchcraft reading their articles, and then I'm presenting a workshop and leading a ritual at the same local event that they are also presenting a workshop. And the workshop that they were presenting was also a workshop idea that I had been devising at the time for like my own audience. Yeah, so it was really wild. Yeah, so there have been specific people, and then of course years later Pathos, and a lot of the Pathos bloggers, like now a lot of the Llewellyn authors and people who I know from social media and online, like a lot of them I know because they're Pathos bloggers. And it was the same thing where over the years I read a lot of them and I just grew to really like some people's thoughts and the way they talked about things, and there were other ones that I really didn't enjoy their content, so I just kind of got to know sort of which names I was more likely to click on, because I felt like I would appreciate the way they talk about things. Not to say that like they were people who always agreed with me. Sometimes they were people who think very similarly to the way I do, and so I like to hear what they have to say. But sometimes there are people who think differently than how I do, but I like the way that they say it. You know what I mean? Like, I never enjoyed reading certain types of content that just felt like not the way I wanted to consume content. And it wasn't just about the fact that they were disagreeing, it was like the whole sort of vibe behind the way that it was being said, right? If that makes sense. So I guess, like, I don't know, but I think you know what I mean. I just got to know over time, like, whose name I was more likely to click on if I was looking something up and there were multiple articles. I was like, okay, I want to read this one and this one. That one I don't care about as much, right? So, but like, yeah, Pathos bloggers. But really, really early on, yeah, it was books and a few websites and trying to find whatever I could at the local library. And at the time there was really nothing, but like now, over the years, there are so many more things available that like now it's really frustrating to me when people who are coming into it now are like, there's nothing here, there's no resources, there's no events, there's no pagans in my area. Because that's definitely how I felt at the beginning, and I think part of it is just feeling that way at the beginning before we've actually like reached out and realized who's there. But I also think there's definitely an element of, at a certain point in our local history, there wasn't stuff going on. Like my local Pagan Pride event has just been going on for like 11 or 12 years. So even that event did not exist before 2009. So, you know, like there are just times when, yeah, those things did not exist. But then like now, there's a lot of big things that have been going on for years. They are very heavily publicized. If you Google it even, or, you know, whatever search function, I imagine, if you look up on the internet the words like pagan events and the name of my state, a ton of stuff comes up. So now it's a little bit different for me hearing people say, there's nothing here, there's nothing here, or like, I haven't found anyone yet. And it's like, well, where have you been looking? How have you been looking? And usually it's like, I put a post on Instagram with a hashtag, and it's like, okay, did you click on that hashtag yourself and scroll through and see all the other people using it and go to their account and leave a comment and engage with their stuff? Like, are you also doing that work? Because that's one element of it. It's one thing to just put a hashtag on there and sit and wait for somebody else to look at the hashtag and talk to you. But if you're not actually doing it yourself, how are we to assume that other people are doing that work? If you think that's too much work, why do you think other people are going to do that work, right? But also, are you looking up what else is in the area? Like Thorn mentioned, there would be like flyers posted on bulletin boards at witchy shops or cafes and stuff like that. That is definitely something that had happened in my area in the past and still happens, because there are a lot of people in our communities who don't have access to the internet, who don't have a smartphone, who are not on Facebook and things like this. And so if we are only using one method of reaching people, we are automatically missing a ton of people who don't have access to that thing. And maybe that thing is not even just the internet as a whole or smartphones or whatever, but maybe it's a specific platform too, right? Like if you're only posting things on one specific social media platform, there are a lot of people who don't have that platform. So if you use multiple, you should talk about it on multiple, right? But so that's why, like, at the time, you know, Witchbox was a big thing because everybody knew to go there. Now there's kind of a lot of options. There's not just one place to go. So we tend to post about it wherever we happen to be, and we're not all on every type of social media, and that's fine. I just think we have to remember that. like I choose not to be on social media platforms. So I know that I'm not likely to find out about stuff that's only being advertised there. And I wish that people would remember that and try to advertise on multiple platforms, but maybe those people also choose not to be on certain platforms. So, you know, that happens. I feel very lucky to have some friends who are on other platforms than I am, who will then share information with the rest of us because they know that some of us choose not to be on that platform. So when we work together, we can make sure everybody's hearing about the stuff. But yeah, like bulletin boards, advertisements that are actually in physical locations. Not everybody can get to a physical location either, but like there's barriers and accessibility discussions to be had about all these types of things too, which is why the internet can be more accessible for people who can't get places physically all the time or financially can't afford to, or whatever the case may be. But then, yeah, not everybody has the internet either, so there are pros and cons of everything. But I feel like there are only more options now, and that is ultimately a good thing, but also comes with a lot of responsibility for like how we actually utilize those. You know what I mean? I've been rambling for so long that my phone actually already cut me off, and I had to restart it for these last 5 minutes. So I really should just wrap it up. But and hopefully my nails are dry by now. I finished them forever ago, as you can see. But yeah, they look like this, but I did opposite. So mostly black on those toes and mostly the teal on those. So it's like this. But same basic idea. I'm gonna go do stuff and hang out with a friend in person today and maybe do witchy stuff. It's the full moon when I'm recording this too. So, yeah. So many other thoughts to be said, but I just really wanted to ramble about this because, as usual, so much of what Thorn says is exactly what I've been thinking about and talking to other people about in person so much of the time. So I was just like, yes, I talk about this stuff all the time at the museum with our guests. I talk about this with my friends online all the time. So maybe I should actually say it to my audience as well, because maybe you would enjoy that. So thank you so much for watching and or listening to this long ramble. I hope you got some other stuff done around the house while you were listening to this. I know a lot of you do that. I do it too. So I'll see you next time. And until then, don't forget to be awesome, blessed be, and goodbye.